The snow had been falling for 3 hours before Annie Hart admitted to herself that she was going to die out here. She had not planned for this. Nobody ever planned to be stranded in the Wyoming high country in the middle of November, 1879, with a lame horse and a sky that had turned the color of iron slag somewhere around midday. She had ridden out from her father's ranch, the Double H spread southeast of Laramie, to check the fence line on the eastern pasture where the cattle had been drifting through a broken section. It was supposed to be a straightforward ride out and back before supper, simple enough that she had not even told anyone where she was going. That particular oversight now seemed like the most catastrophic decision of her 22 years on this earth. The mare had thrown a shoe on the rocky ground near Crow Creek Hollow, and then the temperature had dropped with a swiftness that felt almost personal, as though the mountain itself had decided to settle an old grudge. Annie had walked the horse as long as she could, moving upslope because she remembered hearing her father say that in a whiteout you always move toward something distinctive, something you might recognize. Never just wander flat ground where all directions look the same. But the wind had come screaming down off the Medicine Bow Range like a living thing with teeth, and the snow had thickened from a pretty, drifting fall into something violent and horizontal, and her gloves were not nearly warm enough, and she had lost the creek sound somewhere in the last half hour. The horse, a steady bay mare named Copper, had pressed close against Annie's side as they walked. Annie was grateful for the warmth of the animal's flank and more grateful that Copper had not panicked, had simply walked when Annie walked and stopped when Annie stopped and looked at her with those dark, patient eyes as if to say that whatever decision Annie made next, she would accept it without complaint. That was more than most people had ever offered her, and Annie had found herself talking quietly to the mare just to hear a voice in all that white silence. Then she had seen the shape. It was nothing more than a darkness against the snow at first, a squarish shadow that did not move and did not belong to any tree she could identify. She had pulled Copper toward it, one hand fisted in the mare's mane for warmth and guidance both, and as she drew closer the shape resolved into walls and a roof, and a door hanging partially open on a single leather hinge. A trapper's shack, old and rough-built and clearly abandoned for some time, but with 4 walls and a roof that looked solid enough to shed snow, and a door she could close against the wind. Annie Hart had never been more grateful for an ugly building in her life. She got Copper under the linta that jutted off the shack's western wall, not much shelter but enough to break the wind, and she tied the mare's lead to one of the support posts with stiff, clumsy fingers. Then she shouldered the shack's door open and stepped inside. The interior smelled of old fur and mildew and the ghost of wood smoke from fires long dead. There was a small iron stove in the corner with a broken pipe that someone had patched with a wrapped strip of rawhide. There was a rough-hewn table and a single stool. There was a wooden crate against the far wall with a few rusted traps inside and a length of rope, and mercifully, a small pile of split wood that had dried out so completely it had turned pale gray as driftwood. There were no blankets, no food, no tools beyond the rusted traps, and the window opening had been boarded over with slats that let through thin blades of frozen air. But there was wood, and there was the stove, and Annie had matches in her coat pocket because her father, Thomas Hart, had taught her when she was 7 years old that you always carry matches and you always carry your belt knife, and she had never once forgotten that lesson. The fire took 4 attempts because her fingers were too cold to work properly, and she kept dropping the matches. But it caught at last, and she nursed it along with careful breath and small, careful additions of wood until it was burning with real heat. She pulled the stool close to the stove and held her hands out and felt the painful, tingling return of sensation in her fingers and toes, and she told herself she was all right. She was fine. She was safe enough until the storm passed. She told herself that for about an hour before the wood began to run low and the wind outside intensified, and she started calculating how long the shelter could maintain enough heat to keep her alive, and the numbers did not come out favorably. Nobody knew where she was. That was the thing that settled on her chest like a stone. Her father would notice her absence at supper time, and he would ask the hands, and they would say they had not seen which direction she rode, and then it would be full dark, and the storm would be at its worst, and Thomas Hart was a practical man who would not send his hands out into a blizzard at night for any reason. He would wait until morning. He would be right to wait. She knew that. She also knew that by morning the temperature up here in the high country, where she now suspected she had drifted east of the hollow and north toward the timbered ridgeline, could drop to 30 below or worse. The stove could not burn indefinitely with what would remain. And copper, even tied in that lean-to, was not going to fare well through a night like this one. Annie added the last decent piece of wood to the stove, pulled her coat tighter, and said aloud to the empty shack, "Well, this is a predicament." She did not hear the horse outside until it stopped. She heard it stop, the sudden absence of hoofbeats she had not even consciously registered through the wind noise, and then she heard boots on the frozen ground, and then the sound of the door being tested, and then a voice, low and deliberate, said, "Whoever's in there, I'm coming inside. I mean no harm." The door opened. He was enormous. That was Annie's first thought, which was perhaps an uncharitable way to greet a rescuer, but it was the truth of it. The man who stepped through that doorway had to duck to clear the frame, and he filled the opening so completely that the wind and snow outside vanished behind him as if a wall had been erected. He was broad across the shoulders in a way that went beyond what a coat could explain, and when he pulled the door shut behind him and turned to look at her, she saw that his face was angular and weathered, darkened by sun and cold both, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same granite as the mountains he apparently lived in. His hair was dark brown and fell past his collar, pushed back from his face by the wind and damp with snow, and his beard was close-trimmed enough to show the line of his jaw but full enough to suggest he did not spend much time worrying about how it looked. His eyes were the color of pine trees in shadow, a deep, particular green, and they moved quickly around the shack, cataloging it with the efficiency of a man who made a daily habit of assessing unfamiliar spaces for danger. He looked at the stove. He looked at the nearly empty wood pile. He looked at her cold, pinched face and her inadequate gloves, which she had wrung and worried into a damp ball in her lap. Then he looked at her directly, and something in his expression shifted from assessment to something that was not quite concern but was close to it. "You the only one here?" he asked. "Yes," Annie said. She was 22 years old and the daughter of a cattleman, and she had been riding this country since she was old enough to sit a horse, and she did not intend to be frightened of a stranger in a shack just because he was very large. "I am. My horse threw a shoe. The storm came in fast." "It did," the man agreed. He crossed to the stove without ceremony, crouched before it with the ease of a man who spent considerable time crouching before things, and examined the remaining wood. He did not appear disturbed by what he found. He stood, went back to the door, and disappeared outside for perhaps 3 minutes while Annie sat very still and listened to the sounds of something heavy being moved and organized beyond the wall. When he returned, he was carrying an armload of split wood that nearly obscured his entire torso, the pieces stacked from his waist to his chin, and he set them down beside the stove with practiced care and went out again. He made 3 trips. By the time he was done, there was enough wood stacked against the wall of that shack to burn for 12 hours. Annie watched all of this with her hands folded in her lap and something warm happening in her chest that was distinct from the heat of the stove. "You carry all that wood on your horse?" she asked when he finally pulled the door shut for the last time and began knocking snow from his coat. "Pack mule mostly," he said. "I run a line of traps through this country. I keep caches." He shrugged one enormous shoulder as if this were unremarkable. "This shack was one of my regular checks. Noticed the smoke from the pipe when I was coming down the ridge." "I repaired the pipe," Annie said, nodding toward the rawhide wrapped section. "Or rather, whoever built this place repaired it at some point. It was already patched." "I know," the man said. "I patched it about 2 years ago." He looked at the patch with a critical eye. "Held up pretty well. Your shack wasn't mine to begin with. Old Swede named Erickson built it. He passed on the winter of '76. Nobody else was using it." Annie absorbed this. "Then thank you," she said, "both for the shack and for the wood. I am Annie Hart. My father runs the Double H Ranch southeast of Laramie." The man pulled off one of his heavy gloves and extended a hand to her. His hand was enormous and calloused in the particular way of a man who worked with rope and iron and wood every day of his life. "Grant Hunter," he said. She shook his hand. His grip was careful, deliberate, the grip of a man who knew his own strength and took pains with it. "You live up here in the high country?" she asked. "I do," he said. "Got a cabin about 4 miles north. Been up here about 7 years now." He added a piece of wood to the stove with the same economy of motion he seemed to apply to everything. "Storm's going to run through the night, maybe into morning." "I was afraid of that." Annie looked at the window slats and listened to the wind. "My father will be worried." "Nothing to be done about it tonight," Grant said. He said it without cruelty, just straightforwardly, the way a man states a fact about weather or terrain. "Come first light and a break in the wind, I can get you down to the creek road. Someone from your ranch will know to look there." "Yes," Annie said. "They would." She paused. "My mare is in the lean-to." She threw a shoe. He was already standing, already reaching back for his coat. "I'll check her," he said. "You do not need to go back out in that. I'll check her," he said again, not rudely, just with the certainty of a man who had already made up his mind and saw no reason to debate the matter. He was outside for perhaps 10 minutes. When he returned, snow-dusted and impassive, he said, "She's doing all right. I put my blanket on her and blocked up the open side of the lean-to with some brush I cut. She's got some grain from my pack. She'll come through fine." Annie looked at him. He had given his blanket to her horse, the blanket he had presumably been intending to use himself. She opened her mouth and closed it again. "Thank you," she said. That was kind." He sat down on the floor with his back against the wall, pulling off his coat and folding it with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to managing his own comfort without fuss. His flannel shirt beneath was dark blue and clearly well worn, and when he settled back against the wall and stretched his long legs out, she could see the breadth of his chest and the way his arms, crossed loosely over his stomach, filled the sleeves of that shirt with muscle that was not decorative but entirely functional. He was, she thought, the most physically substantial human being she had ever been in a room with, and she was the daughter of cattlemen and cowboys. He seemed completely unaware of it. "Do you trap alone?" she asked, because the silence was becoming the kind that needed filling, and she found, to her own mild surprise, that she was genuinely curious about him. "Most of the time," Grant said. He watched the stove with those green eyes and seemed to turn the question over before he answered it, the way a careful man handles a thought before he speaks it. "Had a partner first few years. He went south when the beaver runs started thinning out up here. Lots of men did. Went to Colorado, New Mexico. Some went all the way to the Pacific Northwest." He shifted slightly. "I stayed." "Why?" He looked at her directly for the first time since he had sat down, and there was something in that look that was direct and honest and entirely unperformed. "I like it up here," he said simply. "Always have, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, maybe." Annie understood that more than she expected to. She had grown up on a ranch, and she knew the particular love of difficult country, the way the land could be brutal and beautiful in the same breath, and how that combination got under your skin and became part of who you were. "I know what you mean," she said. "My father has been ranching this country for 20 years, and there is not a single year that was easy, and he would not trade it for anything." Grant nodded slowly. "Thomas Hart," he said. "I've heard of him, good reputation." "He's a good man," Annie said, and meant it completely. Her mother had died of fever when Annie was 12, and Thomas Hart had raised her alone after that, had taught her to ride and rope and red fence line and manage cattle ledgers and shoot a rifle at 100 yards. He was not a demonstrative man, cattlemen rarely were, but she had never once doubted that she was loved. "You manage the ranch with him?" Grant asked. I do. We have 4 hands year-round and 2 more in spring for branding. I handle the books and the supply orders and the fence checking. She smiled slightly. Which is what got me into this situation. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile but the suggestion of one, a deepening of the crease at the corner of his mouth. At least you had matches, he said. My father taught me, she said. He said you always carry matches and your belt knife. Grant reached inside his coat, which lay folded beside him, and produced a small flask. He held it out toward her. Whiskey, he said. It'll help. She took it. The whiskey was rough and good and spread heat through her chest with gratifying immediacy. She handed it back. He took a brief swallow himself and tucked the flask away. What do you do with the furs? She asked. Trade them down in Laramie, he said. Come down maybe 4 times a year, buy what I need and go back up. Have you ever thought about, she stopped herself. What? I was going to say, have you ever thought about coming down permanent? But that seems rude, given that you have clearly made a considered choice about how to live. He looked at her with something that might have been amusement. It's not rude, he said. Most people who meet me assume I'm living up here because I can't manage to live down there. That is not what I assumed, Annie said, and she was telling the truth. He studied her for a moment. No, he said slowly, I don't suppose it is. The storm pressed against the shack like something trying to get in. The iron stove ticked and clicked as the metal expanded in the heat, and the fire's glow threw long orange shapes across the rough-planked walls. Outside, the wind moved through the pine tops with a sound like a river, and occasionally a harder gust would find the gap in the boarded window and drive a thin, cold line of air across the floor. But inside there was warmth, genuine and radiating warmth, and Annie felt herself begin to relax by degrees, felt the tension she had been carrying in her shoulders since the mare through her shoe begin to loosen. They talked. She had not expected that, had expected a terse, competent man who would sit in silence through the night and escort her down the mountain at first light, and that would be the sum of it. Instead, Grant Hunter turned out to be a man of considerable quiet intelligence who had strong opinions about horse breeding and the territorial grazing laws that the large outfits were using to squeeze out small ranchers, and who had read more books than Annie had expected, though he admitted his library was limited to what he could pack in and what had been left behind in the cabin by the man he had bought it from. What did you read most recently? She asked. He thought about it. Cooper, he said. The Deerslayer, and a book about the Lewis and Clark expedition that I've read 4 times now. Why 4 times? Because every time I read it I find something new in it, he said. The way men think about country they've never seen, the way they describe what they find, I like the finding out part. So do I, Annie said. I have been trying to convince my father to let me go to Denver for the livestock exposition next spring, not just for the cattle but to see it, to find out what it's like. Have you been further than Laramie? Once to Cheyenne, that's all. She looked at the stove. The ranch doesn't leave much time for traveling. No, Grant agreed. Neither does the mountain. They were quiet for a comfortable while after that, the kind of quiet that does not require filling, and Annie found herself looking at him in the firelight and thinking that he was not merely physically impressive, which he certainly was, but that there was something settled and sure about him that she found unexpectedly compelling. He was a man who had made a clear-eyed choice about how to live and lived it without apology or performance, and in her experience that kind of clarity was rarer than it should be. She slept eventually. She had not intended to, but the warmth and the exhaustion and the steady sound of the storm all conspired against her resolve, and she woke with a start sometime deep in the night to find that Grant had arranged his coat around her shoulders while she slept and was himself sitting upright with his back against the wall, awake and quiet, tending the fire with the unhurried patience of a man accustomed to long watches. You should sleep, she said, embarrassed. I'll sleep when the storm breaks, he said. I sleep light anyway, old habit. She started to remove the coat. He stopped her with a word. Keep it, he said. You need it more than I do. She looked at him in the firelight, this very large, very calm man who had given his blanket to her horse and his coat to her, and who sat against a cold wall in a flannel shirt as though discomfort were beneath his notice. And she felt something she could not immediately name, something that settled into her chest with a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. "Thank you, Grant," she said, using his first name for the first time without thinking about it. He looked at her, and something in his green eyes was quiet and warm and very still. "Get some sleep, Annie," he said. She did. She woke to gray light seeping through the gaps in the window boards and the knowledge, immediate and physical, that the wind had dropped. The quality of the silence was different now, not the taut, pressurized silence of a blizzard, but the open, clean silence of aftermath, of a storm spent and gone. She sat up and found Grant crouched by the stove, adding the last of the wood and holding a small tin pot close to the heat. "Coffee?" she asked, astonished. He held up the pot. "Camp coffee," he said. "It's not good coffee, but it's hot. Right now it is the best thing I can imagine," she said, and meant it entirely. He poured some into a tin cup and handed it to her, and she wrapped her cold hands around it and breathed the steam and felt the morning settle into something almost pleasant. She handed him back his coat, which he put on with the businesslike economy of a man getting to work. He went out to check the mare and came back to report that Copper had come through the night in reasonable shape, though she was going to need a new shoe before she could be ridden properly. "She can walk it," Annie said. "I'll walk with her." "I know the way to the creek road," Grant said. "I'll take you." They packed up what little needed packing and stepped out into a world that had been entirely remade overnight. The snow lay 3 feet deep in the open and deeper in the drifts, and it had that particular blinding brilliance that comes after a storm when the sky clears perfectly blue and the sun finds every crystal. The pine trees wore it in great heavy curtains on their branches. The mountains above were white from ridgeline to treeline, and the air was shockingly cold and absolutely still, and so clean that Annie breathed it in like something to be saved. Grant's horse was a big gray gelding, patient and deliberate as his owner, and the pack mule beside it was loaded and resigned. He led them off through the snow with Annie and Copper following, and he chose a path through the timber where the snowpack was shallower and the footing better, and where the morning light slanted through the trees in long golden bands that made the whole passage feel less like an emergency and more like something chosen. They talked while they walked. They talked about cattle and fur prices and the territorial legislature's ongoing battles over water rights, and about the Sioux situation that had convulsed the whole region only a few years prior. And Annie said things she had thought for a long time but rarely said aloud, because the men around her ranch were not particularly interested in her political opinions. And Grant listened and responded and pushed back on some of it in ways that were thoughtful rather than dismissive. And she found herself thinking that she had not had this kind of conversation since she had spent an afternoon 2 summers ago talking with the schoolteacher who had passed through on her way to a posting in Denver. It took about 2 hours to reach the creek road. She knew it the moment she saw it, the flat and compressed look of a track that had been traveled enough to leave a mark even under fresh snow. She stopped and turned to thank him and found him looking at her with that steady, careful attention she was already beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. "Your father's men will come this way," he said. "You should hear them before too long." "Yes," Annie agreed. She did not want to say what she was thinking, which was that she was not entirely ready for this part to be over. It was a strange thought, given that she had spent the night in an abandoned shack in a blizzard and logically should want nothing more than to be home and warm and eating a proper breakfast. But the strange thought was there, and she could not entirely dismiss it. "Grant," she said, "I owe you quite a lot." "You don't owe me anything," he said, with a finality that was not cold but was not open for argument. "I do," she said, "and I would like the chance to repay it. My father would want to thank you as well." "You would be welcome at the Double H." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his green eyes, something that was considered and not immediate, a man not given to impulsive decisions working through a thought. "I come through Laramie in about 3 weeks," he said at last. "Trading run." "Come to the ranch," she said. "We're 3 miles southeast of town on the Pole Creek Road. The gate has a double H iron brand on the post. You won't miss it." He nodded once slowly, the way a man accepts a commission he intends to take seriously. Then they heard it, hoofbeats on the creek road, coming from the south, multiple horses moving at speed. "That'll be them," Grant said. It was. 4 riders came around the bend of the creek road, and the man at the front was Thomas Hart himself, 50 years old and iron gray at the temples, and riding with the particular forward-leaning urgency of a worried father. He pulled his horse up short when he saw Annie standing at the roadside with a strange man and a pack string, and his expression cycled through about 7 separate emotions in the space of 2 seconds. Annie. He was off his horse before it had fully stopped. He covered the ground between them in a few long strides and took her by the shoulders and looked at her face with such unguarded relief that she felt her throat tighten. "I went out at first light. The boys said you rode east yesterday morning. We've been—" He stopped, swallowed. "Are you all right?" "I am fine," she said. "I am completely fine. My mare threw a shoe and the storm came in and I found shelter in a trapper's shack up on the ridge." She turned to gesture at Grant. "This man found me. He brought wood and he kept the fire going all night and he guided me down this morning." Thomas Hart turned. He had the measuring look of a man who had spent decades assessing everything from bull stock to potential hands to weather fronts, and he applied it to Grant Hunter now with absolute thoroughness. What he found apparently satisfied him because he stepped forward and extended his hand. "Thomas Hart," he said, "I am in your debt, sir." "Grant Hunter," Grant said, shaking the offered hand. She was managing all right. She had a fire going. "He is being modest," Annie said. "He brought enough wood for 12 hours and gave his blanket to Copper and sat up all night to tend the fire." Thomas Hart looked at Grant with an expression that had moved well past approval into something closer to respect. "You'll come back to the ranch," he said. It was not quite a question. "You'll have a meal and a bed and whatever else you need." "I appreciate that," Grant said, with the careful courtesy of a man accepting a genuine offer, "but I've got traps to run. I'll be through Laramie in a few weeks. I said I'd stop in." "You had better," Thomas said, with a firmness that was not unfriendly. He turned and looked at one of his hands, a lean man named Garrett who rode a piebald horse. "Garrett, give Mr. Hunter your canteen and those biscuits from your saddlebag." Garrett complied without complaint. Grant accepted the items with a nod of genuine gratitude, tucked the biscuits away, and turned once more to look at Annie. She held his gaze for a moment that felt slightly longer than necessary, and that she was aware her father was observing. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks, Grant confirmed. He turned the gray and the mule and rode back up the creek road and into the trees and was gone, absorbed into the white morning with the quiet efficiency of a man who lived in mountain country and moved through it like he belonged there. Annie watched the tree line for a moment after he disappeared. Then she turned to find her father watching her with an expression that was thoughtful and careful and entirely free of surprise, which was somehow more interesting than if he had looked surprised. "Let's get you home," Thomas Hart said simply. She nodded, took Copper's lead, and walked south along the creek road with the winter sun climbing behind her and something new settled carefully in her chest, alongside the cold and the exhaustion and the relief. The 3 weeks passed in the way that weeks pass when you find yourself listening for something you cannot name, too fast in the moments when you were not thinking about it, and too slow in the moments when you were. Annie threw herself into the work of the ranch with extra focus, reconciling the feed ledgers for winter, and corresponding with the supply merchant in Laramie about the price of hay, and spending a good deal of time in the barn with Copper while the mare recovered from her ordeal and her newly replaced shoe. She thought about Grant Hunter more than she intended to. She thought about the way he moved, that large, deliberate economy of motion, nothing wasted, everything purposeful. She thought about his voice, which was deep and not loud, a voice that did not need volume to carry. She thought about the way he had listened to her, not with the half-attention of a man waiting for a pause in which to insert his own opinion, but with the focused engagement of a man who genuinely wanted to understand what you were saying. She had known very few people like that, men or women both. She also thought about the fact that she knew very little about him, that he had been in the mountains 7 years, that he had come from somewhere because everyone came from somewhere, and she did not know where. That he had a cabin 4 miles north of the shack, and he ran trap lines, and he had read Cooper and the Lewis and Clark journals, and he made camp coffee that was not good but was hot. That was the sum of what she knew, and it felt simultaneously like very little and like more than she knew about most people she had spent years around. Her father said nothing about Grant Hunter for the full 3 weeks. This was a parental strategy she recognized as deliberate, and which she appreciated more than she would have appreciated commentary. He arrived on a Tuesday, 22 days after he had ridden away into the pines. Annie saw him from the kitchen window, the big gray gelding coming through the gate below the Double H iron brand, the pack mule trailing behind, and the very large man in the saddle sitting with the relaxed uprightness of someone who spent more hours on horseback than off. She set down the coffee pot she was holding, looked at her reflection in the small mirror by the kitchen door, pushed a strand of dark hair back into its pin, and went outside. He pulled up when he saw her come out of the house, and he took off his hat, which struck her as unexpectedly formal coming from a man who had spent a night on a cold floor with her, and who generally seemed to operate well outside the boundaries of social performance. His hair was dark and damp from the ride, pushed back from his face, and his jaw was slightly less covered in beard than it had been in the shack, which told her he had attended to himself before coming down from the mountain, and that detail told her something she tucked away carefully. "You made it," she said. "Said I would," he replied. Thomas Hart appeared from the direction of the barn with the unerring instinct of a ranch owner who always knew when someone arrived at his gate. He greeted Grant with the warmth of a man paying a genuine debt, took the gray and the mule himself, and handed them to Garrett with instructions about grain and water, and brought Grant inside with the firm hospitality of a man who did not take no for an answer in his own house. The afternoon was good. The kitchen smelled of the beef stew Annie had started that morning, and the coffee was real coffee, not camp coffee, and Thomas Hart sat across from Grant Hunter and talked to him with the straightforward respect of one competent man for another. They talked about the fur market and the railroad's effect on freighting costs, and about a disputed water right that was working its way through the territorial courts and would likely affect small operators throughout the basin. Grant's opinions on all of it were measured and informed and presented without posturing, and Annie could see her father adjusting his assessment of the man upward as the conversation went on, the way you could see a good judge of horses revising his first impression when a horse that looked ordinary turned out to move beautifully. Annie sat at the table and was part of the conversation in a way she had not always been permitted to be in similar situations, because Thomas Hart had always treated her as a partner in the ranch and not as a decoration for the kitchen. She asked Grant about the winter conditions higher up and what the snowpack was suggesting about the spring runoff, and whether the beaver had been recovering as some of the trappers were claiming. He answered her questions with the same direct attention he had given her in the shack, and she was aware that her father noticed this too. After supper, Grant helped clear the table without being asked, which seemed to mildly astonish Garrett, who was eating with them and who had the look of a man watching a large dog demonstrate an unexpected courtesy. Annie caught Grant's eye over the stack of plates, and he had that almost smile again, the deepening crease, and she looked quickly away because she did not want to be observed looking at him in whatever way she suspected she was looking at him. He stayed the night in the bunkhouse, and the next morning at breakfast Annie found him at the table early, drinking coffee and looking out the window at the pre-dawn sky with the patience of a man accustomed to early hours. "There is a section of the east fence I need to check today," she said, setting a plate in front of him. "The same section I was riding toward when the storm caught me. It still hasn't been done properly." He looked at her. "I'll come with you," he said. "You have a trading run to finish." "I finished it yesterday before I came here," he said. I have a few days before I need to go back up." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. "We leave after breakfast." They rode out together after the sun was fully up, moving east through country that was familiar to Annie and new to Grant. And she found herself narrating it in the way you narrate things to someone you want to share them with. She showed him the draw where the cattle sheltered in hard weather, and the spring that ran year-round, and the old cottonwood at the southeast corner of the property that had been struck by lightning so many times it had a kind of scorched dignity, standing there in its broken crown as if it had decided to outlast everything that hit it. Grant listened to all of it the way he listened to everything, with that focused, genuine attention, and he asked questions that were specific and showed he was actually thinking about what she told him. He knew about soil and watershed and grazing patterns from his years in mountain country, and some of what he said about the spring, and the draw helped her think about the land in ways she had not considered before. They fixed the fence line together, working without much conversation because they were both practical people who understood that fences were fixed by working and not by talking about it. He was tremendously useful at the physical work, driving the posts with a single-handed efficiency that would have taken Annie 3 times the effort. And she pulled the wire and set the staples, and they moved along the line in a rhythm that felt natural and easy in a way that work between two people often isn't until they have worked together many times. On the ride back, the light was going golden and the air was cold and sharp with the smell of pine from the ridge, and somewhere a pair of ravens called back and forth above the tree line. "Can I ask you something?" Annie said. "Go ahead," Grant said. "Where did you come from, before the mountain?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive but considering. "Pennsylvania," he said. "My father was a furniture maker. I worked in his shop from the time I was old enough to hold a plane. But I read everything I could find about the West, and I knew by the time I was 18 that I was going to come here." He paused. "My father thought I was making a mistake. My mother thought I would come back after a year and settle down and make furniture. Do you think they were right?" "About which part?" "Either part." "No," he said quietly. "I don't think they were right." He looked out at the long sweep of snow-covered grassland and the mountains behind it. "But I think they loved me and were afraid for me, and that's not the same as being right." Annie thought about her mother, gone 10 years now, and about the shape her absence had left in the house and in her father and in herself. "My mother used to say that the best things scare you a little," she said, "before they become the best things." Grant turned to look at her, and the angle of the late light caught his eyes and made them very green, and he held her gaze for a moment that was not ambiguous. "That sounds about right," he said. He stayed 4 days. By the end of the second day, Annie was aware that what she felt in his company was not gratitude, or not only gratitude, but something more primary and less convenient. She liked him with a plainness that was not dressed up in any poetry, the way you like good bread or the smell of rain or a horse that responds to your hands with immediate trust. She liked the way he thought and the way he moved and the way he talked and the way he did not talk, and she was almost certain, though she was careful and did not want to be wrong about this, that he felt something of the same. Her father appeared to have reached this same conclusion by the 3rd evening, because he started inventing reasons to be elsewhere. On the 4th morning, Grant said he needed to head back up. The trap line waited, and the weather could change again without much notice, and he had supplies to sort. He said all of this at breakfast with the businesslike manner of a man managing a practical reality, and Annie nodded and said she understood and went to help Garrett saddle the gray while Grant said his goodbyes to Thomas. When she brought the horse around to the front of the house, Grant was standing on the porch, and he came down the steps and took the reins from her and then stood there for a moment holding both the reins and the silence, and she looked up at him in the winter morning and waited. "I'll be back down in the spring," he said. "March most likely, maybe late February if the weather cooperates." "All right," she said. "I'd like to come back," he said, with a deliberateness that made clear he was not talking about the trading run or about thanking her father. He was looking at her in that direct, unhurried way, and there was nothing uncertain in it, nothing performed. Just a very clear and honest man saying a very clear and honest thing. "I would like that," Annie said, and her voice was steadier than she expected. He nodded, and that almost smile deepened into something more actual for a moment, and he swung up onto the gray with a smoothness that belied his size, settled into the saddle and looked down at her from that considerable height. "Stay out of blizzards," he said. "Stay warm," she replied. He rode out through the gate beneath the Double H iron brand and up the Pole Creek road toward the mountains, and this time Annie watched him go with something entirely different from what she had felt watching him disappear into the pines 3 weeks before. This time it felt like a comma, not a period, like a breath held and not yet released. Her father appeared at her elbow. She had not heard him come out of the house. He stood beside her watching the road where Grant had been and said nothing for a considered moment. "He's a good man," Thomas Hart said. "Yes," Annie agreed, "he is." "Honest," her father said. "Not many left like that." "No," Annie said. "I told him he was welcome here whenever he came through." Thomas glanced at her sideways. "He said he'd be back in the spring." "I know," Annie said. "He told me." Thomas made a sound that was not quite a smile and not quite a sigh and went back inside. Annie stood at the gate for another moment in the cold morning air and then went in too, and the winter was long after that, but it was not empty. He came back in February. The weather did cooperate, as he had cautiously hoped, and he rode down from the mountain on the 15th of February, 1880. And Annie was in the barn when she heard the gate and came out to find him there on the gray in the afternoon light, looking like something the mountain had sent down as a reminder of itself. The visit lasted 6 days this time. On the second day they rode up into the foothills together, and he showed her the beginning of his trail, the path that climbed into the high country, and talked about the land up there with a love that was plain and unself-conscious. On the third day they sat in the kitchen after Thomas had gone to bed and talked until very late, the lamp burning low between them on the table, and Annie told him things about her mother she had not said aloud in years. On the fourth day they were riding back from checking the cattle in the south pasture, and a jackrabbit startled Copper and the mare shied and Annie stayed on easily, but Grant had moved his horse between hers and the open ground before the rabbit had stopped running, purely instinctive, the protective reflex of a man who could not seem to help it. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I'm fine," she said. "I know," he said. "I know you're fine." But he had moved anyway, automatically and without thought, and they both knew it, and the knowledge was there between them, warm and significant. On the sixth day, the morning he was to leave, he found her in the barn, and he stood in the doorway for a moment with the cold morning light behind him making a long shadow across the hay. And then he came in and stood in front of her and took her hands in his, carefully, with that measured gentleness he applied to everything that needed handling with care. "Annie," he said. "Yes," she said to whatever he had not yet asked. Something flickered in his eyes. "You don't know what I was going to say." "I think I do," she said. He looked at her hands in his, turned them over once as if considering, and then looked at her face. "I want to court you properly," he said. "I want your father's permission, and I want to do this right. I know I live on a mountain and I'm a trapper, and that's not much to offer someone who has all of this." He said it without embarrassment, just plainly, laying it out honestly the way he did everything. "You are asking me what I think about it," she said, "before you ask him." "Yes," he said, "because what you think matters more." She looked at him standing there in the barn light, this very large, very honest, very careful man who gave his blanket to horses and sat up all night against cold walls and moved his horse between her and any potential danger without thinking about it, and who had come back down from his mountain in February, which was early and difficult because he said he would. She thought about all of that. She thought about it for about 3 seconds. "Yes," she said again. The expression that crossed his face then was not the almost smile, was not the quiet, contained warmth she had come to know. It was something more open than that, something that she understood was not a thing he showed often or easily. He held her hands a moment longer and then released them with the same care with which he had taken them, and he went to find her father. Thomas Hart's answer, Annie was told later by Garrett, who had been within earshot in the adjacent corral and had listened with complete shamelessness, was immediate, direct, and involved a very firm handshake and the words, "Took you long enough." They were engaged in April of 1880, on a clear sky afternoon when the cottonwood at the southeast corner of the Double H was just beginning to show the first pale green of leaf, and they were married in June, in the small church in Laramie that smelled of pine and candle wax and fresh-cut flowers that Annie's friend Clara Bishop had arranged in the windows. The wedding was not large. The hands came, and Clara and her husband Ned, and 3 families from neighboring ranches who had known Thomas Hart for decades, and who looked at Grant Hunter with the thoughtful, reassessing expressions of people revising a first impression. Grant wore a clean dark coat and had his hair combed back and looked, Annie thought with private amusement, like a man in a foreign country who was managing very well on diplomatic instinct alone. He put the ring on her finger with the same deliberate care he applied to everything that mattered and looked at her when he said his words with the clear, direct gaze of a man who was entirely sure, and saying nothing he did not mean. She looked back at him and said hers and meant every word of them. After the ceremony, they had a supper at the Double H. Because the house was larger than the church and Thomas Hart had been cooking and organizing for a week with an intensity that Annie suspected had a great deal to do with having something to do with his hands, while his only daughter got married. There was good food and a fiddle player from town, and a jug of whiskey that circulated the room, and Garrett told 3 stories about ranch mishaps that got funnier with each repetition, and Grant Hunter sat at the table and watched Annie move through the room, and did not stop watching her for most of the evening, which Clara Bishop noticed and reported to her husband with a verdict of entirely besotted and a high degree of approval. They stayed the first night at the ranch and rode north the next morning, up the creek road, and into the foothills and along Grant's trail into the high country. Annie had packed carefully and practically. She was not a woman given to romantic impracticality, and she rode copper with the new shoe and the steady confidence of someone who knew how to ride in mountain country. Grant rode the gray ahead of her on the narrow sections and beside her on the open slopes, and did not treat her as someone who needed managing, which she appreciated, while also being quietly and comprehensively attentive to the trail and the terrain and any potential difficulty, which she also appreciated. The cabin was 4 miles north of the abandoned shack where they had spent the blizzard night, and it was a better cabin than she had been imagining during the months of winter when she had tried not to imagine it too specifically. It was solid and well chinked against the cold, and larger than a trapper's cabin had any right to be, because Grant had added 2 rooms to the original structure over 7 years, with the careful workmanship of a man who had grown up in a furniture maker's shop. There were real shelves along one wall lined with his small collection of books and some tools, and a few things that spoke of a life built with intention, a good iron cook stove with a proper pipe, a table that was level and well-made, a bed frame he had built himself from pine timber that he had seasoned for a year before using. Annie stood in the doorway and looked at it and loved it immediately, which surprised her a little because she had expected it to feel foreign, and she had prepared herself to be a fair witness to whatever she felt without performing anything. But it did not feel foreign. Felt like a place where someone serious and capable had built a serious and capable life, and she was someone serious and capable, and she thought they would do well here. She stepped inside and turned around, and Grant was watching her from the doorway with that carefully contained expression, the one that was not quite showing what it was, and she said, "It's good. You built something real here." He exhaled slightly as if he had been holding something and said, "I thought so, but it matters that you think so." "I do," she said. "Now show me where everything is." The first year was not without its difficulties, which was honest and expected, and which would have been worrying only if everything had been effortless, because Effortless things are built on nothing and fall over in the first wind. Annie was not accustomed to the specific demands of mountain living, the difference between ranch logistics and high-country logistics, the way weather moved differently up here, and the way the seasons had their own particular rhythms that were not quite the rhythms of the basin country she knew. She made mistakes, and she learned from them with the same directness she brought to everything else, and Grant taught her without condescension and learned from her in return, because she knew things about cattle management and land records and dealing with the merchants in Laramie that were genuinely useful and that he had managed in rougher fashion before she arrived. They found a working partnership that was real and equal, and that fit them both, which is the only kind of partnership worth having. She took over the record-keeping for the trap line and the trading runs, which had previously existed only in Grant's very good but entirely mental accounting. And within 2 seasons, she had identified 3 places where they were losing money and renegotiated the terms with the Laramie fur trader, a man named Kolb, who had the look of someone accustomed to having the upper hand in dealings with individual trappers, and who found Annie Hart Hunter unexpectedly and specifically impossible to outmaneuver. She went down to the Double H with Grant every few weeks in the first year, because Thomas Hart was aging and she was his only family, and she was not going to abandon that, and Grant never suggested she should. He drove the wagon when the weather required it and rode alongside her when it didn't and sat at Thomas Hart's table, and talked with the old man with the steady regard of a man who valued what Thomas had built and who understood without being told that caring for Annie included caring about the people she loved. Thomas Hart died in the autumn of 1882, peacefully, in his own house, with Annie holding his hand. He had been slowing for most of that year, and they had both known it was coming, which made it no smaller when it came, but did mean that everything that needed to be said had been said, which is a grace not everyone receives. He left the Double H ranch to Annie outright, every acre and every head of cattle and every tool in the barn, with a brief addendum to the will in his own handwriting that read, "For my daughter, who earned it every day." The question of what to do with the ranch was one they talked through with thoroughness and no small amount of the frank, sometimes difficult honesty that characterized their best conversations. They could sell it. They could lease it to one of the neighboring operations, or they could run it alongside the mountain operation, which was more complex but also more interesting. They decided to run both. Garrett, who had worked the Double H for 12 years and knew every foot of it, became the working foreman with a share of the operation that made it worth his while to stay and run it right. Grant came down from the mountain to the ranch for weeks at a time in the heavy seasons, branding in spring, roundup in fall, and brought his back and his hands and his particular problem-solving intelligence to bear on the cattle work with the same focused competence he brought to everything else. Annie managed the books for both operations and rode between the two with a regularity that became one of those personal rhythms that define a life. Their son was born in the spring of 1883, in the cabin on the mountain, with the assistance of a remarkably capable midwife from Laramie named Mrs. Ochoa, who had come up 2 weeks early, and had drunk Grant Hunter's camp coffee every morning with stoic professionalism. The birth was hard, as births often were in that time and place, and Grant sat outside the cabin door through most of it in the cold spring night with a stillness that Mrs. Ochoa later said, with clinical admiration, was the most disciplined display of worry she had ever witnessed from a father. They named the boy Thomas, after Annie's father, and he came into the world with his mother's dark hair and his father's green eyes, and a robust set of lungs that announced his presence to the entire mountain range. Grant held him with the same extraordinary care he applied to everything fragile and precious, those large rough hands entirely gentle, and looked at Annie over the baby's head with an expression she had never seen from him before, not the contained warmth or the almost smile or the deliberate steadiness, but something that was entirely undefended and vast and real. "Hello, Thomas," Grant said to the baby, very quietly. Thomas Hunter yawned enormously and went asleep. The years that followed were good years, marked by the particular and reliable texture of a life built on good choices and honest work and genuine love. Young Thomas grew up on two landscapes, the mountain with its silence and clean air and the deep knowledge of wild things, and the ranch in the basin with its cattle and its open grassland, and its connection to the small human community of Laramie and the surrounding operations. He was a practical child, curious and watchful in the way of his father and direct in the way of his mother, and he moved between the two worlds with an ease that was probably the best thing either landscape could have given him. Annie became one of the more respected voices in the Laramie Basin on matters of grazing rights and water access as the 1880s wore on, and the range wars that were beginning to roil the larger cattle country further north sent their advance tremors south into Wyoming. She had clear opinions and the organizational ability to back them up, and she appeared at several of the county meetings that were attempting to navigate the increasingly contentious question of open range versus fenced range, with a combination of documented evidence and plain-spoken argument that the other ranchers, most of them men who had initially been uncertain about taking a woman's opinions on such matters seriously, found consistently difficult to rebut. Grant went with her to these meetings and sat in the back and said almost nothing, but more than once Annie noticed that a rancher who had been inclining toward dismissing her position would catch Grant Hunter's eyes from across the room and, apparently upon consideration of the overall situation, decide that further engagement on the point would not be strategically wise. She mentioned this to him on the ride home one evening, and he said, entirely straight-faced, "I don't know what you're talking about," and she laughed so hard that copper startled beneath her. She loved him in the way that deepens with time rather than diminishing with it, which is the only way worth having and which is also the rarest. She loved the way he moved, still, all these years later, that same economy and sureness, though his dark hair was now touched at the temples with gray, and the lines at the corners of his green eyes had deepened with years of squinting into mountain weather. She loved the way he talked to Thomas, treating the boy's questions and observations with the same serious attention he gave to everything, and the way he had, over years of coming to the Double H and dealing with Garrett and the other hands and the neighboring ranchers, developed a social ease he had not started with, though it would never be a natural ease, and everyone could tell he was more comfortable on the mountain than in a room full of people. She loved the way, still, after years together, he moved when he felt she might be at risk automatically, unhesitatingly, himself between her and whatever, and the way he always seemed to know where she was in any space, a quiet and entirely unconscious tracking that she had noticed early and had never once found anything but exactly what it was. They had a daughter in the winter of 1886. They named her Clara, after Annie's friend, who had by that point moved to Denver with Ned but who was alive and well, and delighted to have a baby named after her. Clara Hunter arrived in the mountain cabin in a December snowstorm that would have been alarming if it had not been for the fact that by this point Mrs. Ochoa had delivered so many babies in challenging conditions that she treated the weather as a personal affront rather than a genuine obstacle. Clara was, from the beginning, a different creature from her brother. Where Thomas was watchful and patient, Clara was immediate and bright and impossibly determined, taking her first steps at 10 months with the cheerful confidence of someone who had decided walking was happening, and that the structural uncertainty of the process was simply not relevant. Grant watched this first attempt with an expression that was equal parts terrified and delighted, and when she fell on her padded bottom and looked up at him with an expression of pure offended surprise, he laughed, a real laugh, full and genuine and rare enough that Annie, watching from across the room, felt her heart do something specific and familiar. She went to him later that evening, after both children were asleep, and found him sitting on the porch in the cold, which was a habit he had never entirely given up, looking out at the dark shape of the mountain and the stars above it. She brought 2 cups of coffee, real coffee. She had seen to it that they always had real coffee, and sat beside him and put her head on his shoulder the way she had learned to do in the second year, when she had stopped worrying about whether it was presumptuous, and he had stopped being surprised by it, and they had both settled into the fact of each other with the completeness of people who have genuinely stopped expecting anything else. "She's going to be trouble," Grant said. "Clara." "She's going to be magnificent trouble," he clarified. "Yes," Annie agreed. "She's going to be exactly like your mother must have been, or mine." He turned his head slightly and pressed a kiss to her hair, which was also something he had always done quietly without comment, the way he did most things that came from that deep, unperformed place in him. "Like yours," he said. "I never knew mine well enough to say." She was quiet for a moment. "Tell me about her," she said. "Your mother, you almost never do." He was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was actually thinking rather than deflecting, and then he said, "She was small." Which seems strange given how I turned out. She had a laugh that you could hear through walls. "She died when I was 11, fever." He paused. "My father never really recovered from it. I think that was part of why I left for the West so young. The shape of the missing was very loud in it." Annie thought of her father's house after her mother died, the way the kitchen had felt specifically empty in the mornings, and she knew exactly what he meant. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago," he said, not dismissive, just accurate. "It doesn't stop being something just because it was a long time ago," she said. He made a sound of agreement, and they sat in the cold under the stars, and drank their coffee, and were together in the particular completeness that comes when you have shared enough time and enough honesty with another person that silence between you is not empty at all. The spring of 1888 brought the kind of crisis that the Wyoming ranching country had been building toward for years. The big cattle syndicates, backed largely by Eastern and British capital, had been systematically fencing off public range and filing on water rights with the evident intention of breaking every small operator in the basin. And the spring of 1888 was when those pressures became direct and immediate and personal. A representative of one of the syndicates, a smooth man from Cheyenne named Aldridge, arrived at the Double H with a written offer to buy the property at a price that was insulting enough that even Garrett, who was constitutionally calm, had used language in the bunkhouse afterward that made the other hands look impressed. Annie read the offer at the kitchen table and then set it down and said, "No." Grant, sitting across from her, looked at the offer. "They'll come back with another one," he said. "They're not finished." "I know," Annie said. "We are going to need to be organized. All the small operators, everyone from the McAllister spread to the Hendersons at Pole Creek. If we each fight this alone, they'll pick us off one by one. If we fight it together, we have a case to take to the territorial authorities." Grant looked at her with those green eyes and that expression of direct, uncomplicated pride that he had never seemed to think needed hiding. "Tell me what you need me to do," he said. What she needed was a man who could cover ground quickly, and who had the kind of weathered, reliable physical presence that made people listen, and the kind of reputation that money could not buy, which was a reputation built on years of dealing straight and dealing fair in a community where everyone knew what everyone else was actually worth. What she needed, in short, was Grant Hunter, who spent the next 3 weeks riding between 6 ranch operations and meeting with the small rancher community in Laramie, and persuading the 3 most skeptical operators, by force of calm and plain argument, to join the coalition Annie had designed. The coalition filed a collective complaint with the Territorial Land Office and retained a lawyer from Cheyenne, not one of the syndicate lawyers, but a young man named Herrera who had the look of someone who had spent his whole life being underestimated and had decided to make use of it. And the case worked its way through the territorial system with infuriating slowness over the following year. It ended well. Not perfectly, because nothing in land law ends perfectly, but well. The syndicate's most egregious water filings were overturned on procedural grounds, and 2 of the illegal fence lines along public range were ordered removed. And while the syndicates did not disappear and the pressures on small operators did not vanish, the Double H and its neighboring ranches survived intact, and the coalition that had won the fight stayed organized long enough to influence the terms of Wyoming's eventual statehood in 1890 in ways that were more favorable to small operators than they would otherwise have been. Annie was invited to speak at the statehood celebration in Laramie in July of 1890, which was the kind of public occasion that she had grown into over the years, and which she handled with the combination of warmth and precision that had become her particular signature in these settings. She spoke for 12 minutes about water rights and shared land and the necessity of small operators to the long-term health of the Wyoming economy, and received an enthusiastic reception from the audience, about 2/3 of whom she knew personally. Grant stood at the back of the room and watched her with his arms crossed and that expression, the undefended, vast, entirely real one she had first seen when he held baby Thomas. And when she came off the small stage through the crowd, he was there at the edge of it, exactly where she expected him to be, and she put her hand through his arm and felt the warmth of him through his coat. "Well done," he said. "Thank you," she said. "I meant every word." "I know you did," he said. "That's why it worked." Young Thomas was 7 years old by then, and had developed the habit of following his father through the mountain on the trap line with the absorbed, serious attention of a child who is learning everything and knows it. Grant took this education with the same deliberate care he brought to everything he valued, teaching the boy to read weather and track animals and manage a fire, and treat the mountain with respect rather than fear. Thomas was a natural student of all of it, quiet and observant, and Annie watched them together and felt that particular contentment that comes from watching the people you love being good to each other. Clara, 4 years old and entirely herself, had no patience for the slow study of trapping and spent most of her time in the barn with Copper's current foal, a sturdy young horse she had named Boss with complete assurance, and in following Garrett around the Double H with the focused persistence of someone taking detailed notes. Garrett, who had no children of his own, had capitulated to her completely within about 3 days of her first extended visit, and now answered her questions about cattle and horses and ranch management with the earnest thoroughness of a man who has found an unexpected calling. The summer of 1891 brought a drought that was hard on the basin ranches, and particularly hard on the cattle operations dependent on the creek water for summer pasture. Grant's knowledge of the mountain watershed, accumulated over 15 years of living in it, proved unexpectedly and practically valuable. He knew which secondary springs were still running, and where the water was holding in the high meadows above the tree line, and he worked with Garrett to move the Double H cattle to ground that would have taken any other person months to identify. Annie rode with him to the high meadows on a clear August day, and they let the horses rest by the spring that ran cold and clean even in the drought, and she sat on a flat rock and watched the light move across the slope above them and thought about the trajectory of the years, the way they had moved through so much and built so much and lost some things and gained more than they had lost, and the way all of it had the shape of something intended even when it had not been. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. Not a loaded question, just an honest one, the kind they had always asked each other. He looked at her from where he sat beside the horses, one hand resting on the gray's neck. "Regret what specifically?" "This," she gestured broadly, "the mountain and the ranch and the way the life turned out." He was quiet for a moment with that thinking quiet of his. "No," he said, then with greater precision, "there are things I wish had been different. I wish your mother and my mother had lived. I wish the range pressures on the small operators were not as bad as they are. I wish the decisions made about the Sioux 20 years ago had been made differently." He paused. "But none of that is what you're asking. You're asking about the life we built together." "Yes," she said. "No," he said again. I don't regret it, not one day of it." She looked at him across the high meadow with the mountains above and the blue sky and the cold, clean spring and 11 years of honest, difficult, real and full life between them. And she thought, neither do I, not 1 hour of it. Not the blizzard or the fence riding or the hard birth or the range war spring or the funerals or the loneliness of the first mountain winter or any of it. "Come here," he said, reaching out one hand toward her. She got up from her flat rock and crossed to him and took his hand, and he pulled her into his side with that contained ease of a man who is very strong and knows how to be gentle about it. And she stood with her shoulder against his chest and his arm around her, and looked up at the mountain they had both chosen, in different ways and different times, as the place they belonged. In the autumn of 1893, Thomas Hunter, age 10, announced at the supper table with complete seriousness that he intended to be a naturalist when he grew up and document the wildlife of the Wyoming high country in the manner of the natural historians he had been reading about. Because, he said, somebody needed to do it and he knew the territory. Grant and Annie both looked at him and then at each other, and Grant said, "That seems right," and Annie said, "We'll need to get you more books." And Thomas looked satisfied in the way of a person who has made his position clear and received a fair hearing. Clara, who was 7 by this time and had no patience for deliberation, said that she intended to run the Double H when she was old enough and that Garrett could stay on if he wanted to. Garrett, who happened to be visiting that evening, said he would be honored and that he had been waiting for someone to make this clear. The years arranged themselves around them the way good years do, not without trouble, because life is never without trouble, but with the particular quality of a life being lived fully and honestly by people who know who they are and who they are to each other. The mountain stayed. The ranch stayed. The children grew. Garrett's hair went entirely white, and his back gave him trouble in the cold months, but he was at the Double H every morning at first light, and would be until he decided otherwise, which showed no current signs of happening. Annie's hair went silver at the temples by the time she was 40, which she noticed without particular distress, and which Grant appeared not to notice at all. Or rather, the evidence suggested he noticed, and considered it worth exactly as much attention as the rest of her, which was a great deal of attention delivered in the familiar and consistent and entirely sustaining ways she had come to know and rely upon. He was 44 years old in the summer of 1893, and he was still, objectively and practically, one of the most physically formidable men in the Wyoming high country, a fact that his children took completely for granted, and that the other men in the Laramie ranching community had long since incorporated into their general understanding of the situation. His dark hair was well and truly silver now at the edges, and the lines in his face had deepened with the years and the weather, but the breadth of his shoulders and the quality of his movement had not diminished in any material way, and when he worked alongside the younger hands on the Double H, they tended to find themselves working harder simply because it seemed implied. One evening in late September of 1893, they were sitting on the porch of the mountain cabin in the last warmth of the year, because the cold was coming back in again, and they both knew this was the last evening for sitting outside without real effort for several months. Thomas was inside reading by the lamp. Clara had gone down to the Double H with Garrett for a few days to see about the fall cattle work, which she was managing with the composed authority of a 9-year-old who has spent years learning from the best available sources. The stars were beginning to show above the ridge, and the air had that autumn smell of turning leaves and cooling ground and wood smoke from the cabin, and Annie looked up at the first stars and thought about all of it, where she had been and where she was and the distance between, which was not really a distance but a path, clear and marked and made of choices. "Do you remember the shack?" she asked. He knew immediately which shack she meant. "Yes," he said. "The wood pile," she said. "You made 3 trips in that storm." The fire was going low, he said, as if this were explanation enough, which she supposed it was for him. "I knew then," she said. "Or I thought I knew. I thought this is a man who will make 3 trips in a blizzard to keep a stranger's fire burning, and that is worth knowing." He was quiet for a moment. "I knew before that," he said. She looked at him. "Before you went for the wood, when I walked in and saw you," he said. "You were sitting on that stool with your hands in your lap, and you looked cold, and you looked tired, and you looked completely like you had no intention of admitting either of those things to a stranger. And I thought," he stopped. "What?" she said. "I thought, there is a woman who knows her own mind," he said. "I thought that was something I hadn't seen enough of." She looked at him in the growing dark of the porch, and the stars were coming out above the mountain, and the lamp was lit inside, and there was the smell of the approaching autumn, and of the coffee she was holding, and of the pine trees and the clean high country air, and she felt the full weight of what they had built together and how solid it was, built on 14 years of honest work and honest love and the kind of life that does not make great noise but holds up under everything. "Grant," she said. "Annie," he said. She reached over and put her hand on his forearm, where his sleeve was pushed up and the skin was weathered and warm, and he put his large, careful hand over hers, and they sat in the last warmth of the autumn evening while the stars multiplied above the mountain, and the lamp burned inside where their son read his books about the natural world, and their daughter was down on the ranch. They had kept against all the pressures that had tried to take it. And the cabin was solid around them, and the fire inside was well stocked, and the life they had built was as complete and real and durable as anything that had been built in that high Wyoming country, which was saying something considerable, because what had been built there against the weather and the distance and the difficulty had, by and large, been built to last. Thomas appeared at the cabin door at some point, bringing 2 fresh cups of coffee without being asked, which was the kind of thing he did now at age 10, with the quiet attentiveness of a boy who paid close attention to the people around him, and had decided that bringing hot coffee to his parents was a reasonable contribution to the evening. He set the cups down and looked out at the stars for a moment and said, "There's a great horned owl in the pine below the ridge. I've been hearing him every evening for a week." "I know," Grant said. "He's been there since August." Thomas considered this. "Do you think he's wintering here?" "Probably." Thomas nodded, satisfied, and went back inside. Grant and Annie looked at each other in the star-brightening dark, and there was something in the look that was plain and complete and very good, and they both felt it, and neither of them needed to say so. The mountain was cold, and the stars were out, and the fire was burning, and the children were safe, and the ranch was held, and they were together, which was everything, which had always been everything, which they had both known without needing to be told, from the first moment in a snow-packed abandoned trapper's shack in the Wyoming high country, when a very large man with a blanket and 3 armloads of wood had walked through a storm to keep a stranded woman's fire burning. Which was, when you traced it all the way back, exactly where all of this had started. And from where Annie Hart Hunter sat on that porch in the autumn of 1893, with the mountains above and the stars coming fully out and Grant Hunter's hand warm over hers, it was very clear that wherever it had started and wherever it had gone and everywhere it would yet go, it had been, and it would remain, without reservation or exception, worth every step.